My name is Tarek. Welcome to Thorin's YouTube channel.
Even Neo didn't make his first jump inside the training program in the Matrix. Even Neo had to go through the training programs, download how to do kung fu and fly helicopters. Everyone has to train to improve. So ultimately, this is your last chance. You've got to ask yourself, what do you want to do? Do you want to take the blue pill, wake up tomorrow, still the same dog shit little scrub who knows nothing about the game, doesn't improve much more, makes the same mistakes over and over again? Or do you want to take the red pill, the Boomio pill, learn from the guides of Fallen, Shocks, all the top players that they have on their website, try the different mods out, pre-fire duels, and actually try and become the one, try and become the best version of yourself you can be, become and improve and be a better Counter-Strike player? Now, if I say the name Neo, and I'm talking about a Counter-Strike player, and in Counter-Strike 1.6, you're going to immediately think, right, yeah, well, obviously, you're talking about the Polish guy who, Thorin says is the best player of all time, won the most majors in Counter-Strike 1.6 history, but actually, I'm talking about who is now the other Neo, but interestingly enough, was the original Neo. So his name was Michael Matrega, and he was a player who famously played for German teams such as Advanced Online Losers, A-Losers, Mouse Sports, later on played for some of the lesser teams, and he was the original Neo. He was known to be an elite-level, world-class player playing in majors years before the other Neo, the Polish one, came along. Now, an interesting detail is that actually this Neo, Michael Matrega, was himself half German, half Polish. So that was why it was also interesting that when the other Neo came along in Pentagram, he really had to be exceptional, first of all, to kind of gain space in terms of being called Neo as well. But also, you couldn't even just say, oh, the Polish Neo, because this guy was half Polish as well, the German one. So he's also someone who, beyond his accomplishments in the game, because unfortunately nowadays people might not remember some of the things he did because his main period of being a very good player was like 2003 to 2005. He's also known for one of the classic CS 1.6 frag movies, a movie called Neo, The One. It was by Carla, aka Michael Viker, or Weiker. I think it's Viker is probably how the Germans say it. Those bloody Germans. Classic frag movie. It's a really old school one. Admittedly, I think it is from 2003, since mainly when he was in A Losers, but so it hasn't got really like advanced editing. It doesn't even have the game effects in the game. The sound effects, rather, it just has music over the top of it. But it was a pretty cool movie back in the day and helped build his fame. Now, this is a guy who, yeah, he really came along in 2003. In 2003, his team A Losers managed to win the second ever season of EPS, the ESL Pro Series Germany, which was the big tournament in domestic league there. At the time, EPS only existed in Germany in terms of big LAN finals and big prize money, because the German scene obviously through ESL eventually conquered the world, but that would be many years later. So they were building up the domestic competition initially, and in the early days, Mouse Sports hadn't fully established themselves as the truly dominant force. Obviously, it's only the second season at this point in EPS. But A-Losers winning was a big shock, actually. They weren't the team that everyone thought was going to be the best in Germany. You had the Mouse Sports team that had some of the players, such as Blizzard, such as Johnny R, who were over on Mouse Sports. So it's a shock that A-Losers actually were able to win. And a big part of why they were able to win is they had Neo, who essentially was the MVP of their team and basically was like the MVP of the league at the time. He was breaking out as potentially the best player in the whole German scene. And the German scene, still known to be fairly deep, even though it wasn't at quite the level of the Swedish or the Nordic scenes. Now, this A-Losers team got Johnny R, the most famous sniper of the era from Germany, to come over and play in A-Losers for the summer. And they went to Game Goon, they won that. That was mainly tier 2 teams or some of the lower tier 1 teams. They won that tournament. Went to the CPL summer event, which is the big major. And at the major, they managed to finish 4th place. And this was one of the biggest prize money CPLs of all time. It had a massive amount of money. First place was $60,000, whereas a lot of the first places for big CPL majors would be like $30,000. But it was $60,000, the most ever for first place at a CPL major. And obviously this was the one famously that was won by SK Sweden. Second place was Team 9 from Sweden of Vesslan and Executor. Third place, Team 3D, who had been the reigning world champions at that point in time from the last CPLs. It was Moto and K-Sharp and Rambo. And then in fourth place was A Losers, with Johnny R, but most notably with Neo. This was his first big major, and he really had a very good performance here as well. They managed to beat out a whole bunch of NA teams to get there. They did end up losing to the second and third place team. They lost to Team 3D in the upper bracket in a close game. They lost a fairly convincing game to Team 9 in the lower bracket. Now, they went back home. They played in the Campus Party, which was a tournament, I think it was in Spain actually, which was mainly lower tier 1 and tier 2 teams, and they managed to win that tournament. Then he went over back with Johnny R to Johnny R's previous home, Mouse Sports, and they made what was essentially the German dream team of that era. So late 2003, they made this team, which was Neo, arguably the best German player. They had Johnny R, who was the biggest name of the German players and was a fantastic sniper. They had Roman R, who'd been a classic Mouse Sports player for a long time, was a very stable player, very good all-round player. They had Blizzard, a very good all-round player, really clutch player, and someone who was coming into his own at this point in time, one of the better German players. And they had Gore, who was an Austrian, but was a very skilled, very talented player. I've talked about him in a past video already. Now, with this kind of dream team German lineup, finally Germany would be able to have, in theory, big places at the biggest tournaments of all time. Because before that, Germany at times had some good European teams. They tended to be more around like the 5th to 8th kind of level in Europe. They weren't really going to challenge the top Swedish teams to potentially win the majors. Swedish teams and Norwegian teams and Danish teams weren't quite there at that point in time. Again, they had a lull at that point. But Norwegian and Swedish teams really were the best at this point in time. And then the Orden A team could compete. So they went into the late 2003 end of kind of their run of big international tournaments. They had a CPL Europe event called CPL Copenhagen, and they immediately came out of the gate and finished third place. The only team they lost to at this LAN was a team called GamePoint AMD, later to be known as AMD, Team 64, later to be known as Eyeballers, which was the team with Hyper, and it was the team with Vilden, a classic squad who at that point were emerging as the only real contenders in the world, the only team capable perhaps of beating SK Sweden, the very dominant team that year with Element and Potty and Heaton, who were just way too good. Now at this tournament, that team was able to beat out Mouse Sports, but Mouse Sports took care of everyone else they played. All these top and good Nordic teams they played, they took care of all of them. They lost generally. They played some decent games against that GamePoint team. GamePoint was a very tactical team, but also had some skill in Vilden, and particularly Hyper was a fantastically good player. First big tournament with Neo in the lineup. Third place, still very good and better than you'd normally have expected in the past from some of the German teams. So the German Dream Team was already underway. They then went to the end of that year to CPL Winter. They'd already won the domestic EPS. They'd gotten Mouse Sports back on top. And they went to CPL Winter, which again, very stacked major event. And they managed to finish third place at this event, so one place higher than his last placing at a major when he'd been the losers. And at this tournament, they lost to SK Sweden, but again, everyone lost to SK Sweden in this tournament. They were at the height of their dominance, and that was a very dominant win by SK Sweden. But they managed to beat out Team 64, which was the previous GamePoint team, so that was revenge for CPL Copenhagen. They managed to beat Adrenaline, which was Vestland's team, basically the core of what had been Team 9 and had beaten his A-losers team at the previous major. So that was a very big win for Germany and for Neo in his career. But unfortunately, they didn't get to the final and rematch with SK because they lost to the shock team of the tournament, which was NOA, which was the team that had been formed not long before the tournament and coming with like the 32nd seed, but had a miracle run to the finals. And they did lose a reasonably convincing game to NOA in this tournament, and then they had to finish for third place. But one of the best finishes of Neo's career. The next year, 2004, was a much tougher year. This was a year where they had some very up and down results. So at ESWC, a big major, they were only able to finish 5th to 8th because in the group stage, second group stage, they lost to SK Gaming, who at the time everyone thought was odds-on favourite to win the tournament. They went into the quarterfinals against a not that well-known team, but like known team, but not a very highly considered team called the Titans from Denmark, who ended up beating them heavily in the quarterfinals and actually went on to win that major at ESWC. And at the time had their own kind of prodigy player in Wimp, who was a very young, I think he was like 15 or 16 when he won this tournament, and funnily enough wouldn't be able to play in the CPLs that year because he was too young. They went to Game Goon shortly before CPL Summer. So again, basically similar tournament to some tournaments of the past. At this one, they managed to only finish top 6 interesting detail, because they lost to a pentagram team, which was Neo and Taz. At the time the other Neo, but now the original Neo. If the terminology is not getting too complex for you, in a very close game, which was one of the first big upsets of this Polish team, who obviously later on would have a very big part to play in history of Counter-Strike. They went to CPL Summer, the next big major. They only finished 7th there. They had some disappointing performances, but it was one of those performances where it's almost a bit unfair that they finished 7th, because the two teams they lost to in the main bracket play were the second place team in the end, Eyeballers, the team that had previously been Team 64 AMD that they'd beaten in the last major, and the ones that they'd lost to as game point at CPL Copenhagen. And then later on in the lower bracket, they got upset again by another NA type team doing a miracle run, which is Rival, who ended up finishing 3rd overall, and they lost to them in the lower bracket. Now, at the end of the year, because they didn't get to go to WCG, because famously, in a bunch of occasions that Neo was in mouz Sports, they couldn't use Gore because he was Austrian and they were a German team. He had to use all 5 players from Germany. So they had to use stand-ins, and often as a result, they wouldn't win the German WCG qualifier, so they couldn't go to that major. Now, at the last major of the year for 2004, CPL Winter, they had a terrible performance this time due to some very shocking upsets. They only finished 17th to 24th, or something terrible like that, because they lost to Complexity, who at the time, another miracle team. This is when Fraud had joined the team, when they had their own epic run to, I think it was like 4th or 5th. I think it might have been 5th. They lost an overtime game to them very early in the tournament. Then later on, they lost to another NA team. They lost to De Beers and Hares United 5 team, another overtime game. And so they went out shockingly early. And so you'd think, right, mouz Sports, that might be it for this team, right? Are they going to do much more? 2005, they came back strong, though. Early in the year, they went to the first World Esports Games WEG tournament, where you went to Korea and you played for like a whole month or so. You lived there, you played week to week the games. Now, the 3rd place that they had here doesn't mean a whole lot, and it wasn't a very meaningful run, because there weren't that many good teams at the tournament beyond NOA and 4Kings. NOA, yes, one of the best teams in the world. 4Kings, like, yeah, top 8 maybe team in the world. But the problem is, a bunch of players, including Gore and others, didn't want to go to this tournament because it took like a month and a half in Korea. So yes, Neil was one of the players that went, but actually they ended up using as a stand-in. First of all, I think they used like Toddy, who was like an okay level German player, but not as good as the mouz Sports players. And then they also used Hare from United 5, that team that had beaten them at CPL Winter, who was the brother of Moses, even though he was a German and even though he was American rather, and didn't speak any German. So 3rd place there didn't mean a whole lot. There weren't that many good teams there, really. And obviously, you can't count that as a result against Neo's career. But after that, mouz Sports actually became the best team in the world in the spring going into the summer, because they had CPL Spain took place. And this was a very stacked European event. It even had an NA team like Complexity come over, who at the time were emerging as one of the best NA teams. And at this tournament, mouz Sports went undefeated and won the tournament. And this was a tournament where they beat out SK Denmark, who at the time had a pretty good lineup. They beat out MIBR, who was obviously on the rise. They beat out Complexity twice, won the tournament, including a smashing them 16-2 in the final. At this point in time, he was a very, very good player. When they won this tournament, they were essentially put as the #1 team in the world. NIP had even been at that tournament with their new fused squad of like super players of Eyeballers and SK of the year before. Had tried to make a super team. It hadn't really worked out, and this was one of the tournaments where they finished 3rd and wasn't that great a placing for them. Going into ESWC, mouz Sports were the main favourites to win this major, and you would have thought Neo might actually win a major in his career. In the group stage, second group stage, they had to play against NIP, a slightly different squad from the one that had been at CPL Spain, and they had to play against Complexity in a kind of a revenge match. Complexity beat them, they tied NIP. In the bracket stage, they played WNV from China and narrowly beat them. Now, that would be a story later in the year, because WNV would go on to win WEG at the end of the year. But at this point in time, Chinese teams weren't considered that good. This was actually a good placing from them. In the semi-final, though, they played SK Denmark. And obviously, this is a rematch of the team that they'd beaten early on at CPL Spain. And they lost a really close semi-final to deny them a chance to go to the final, where they would have played Complexity in another rematch. Would have been a rematch of the CPL Spain final. But because they lost here, they could only finish 3rd at best, which they did do by beating the Korean Lunatic High. And they got 3rd place at this major. But Neo had already had 3rd places, had already had top 4 finishes at majors. So this was a really missed opportunity to potentially be the true best team in the world and really win a major, and he wouldn't really get a chance to win a major again in his career, because beyond that, okay, they won a clan-based Euro Cup that wasn't against the best teams. World Cyber Games he actually got to go to. This is the one, though, that was held in Source, so they qualified at 1.6. It was held in Source at the finals. He made it to the round of 8 here, but lost to Adren's K23 team from Kazakhstan, and it was a big shock. But then again, none of these teams really played Source at the time, especially not mouse sports. Last major, CPL Winter 2005, one of the most stacked of all time. And this was a crusher, because there was 2 teams here that they lost to that they'd beaten earlier in the year. So they lost in the upper bracket to Lunatic High, the Korean team that they'd beaten in the 3rd place decider at ESWC. Obviously, Lunatic High went on to finish 2nd at the event behind SK Sweden. They lost in the lower bracket to Catch Gamer, BSL's team, who at this point I think had added Nikon, but again, not even the best Norwegian players at the time, like No Element, No Real, any of these types of players. And they lost quite heavily to them in the lower bracket, and they are a team that they'd beaten early on at CPL Spain earlier in the year. So it was kind of a lot of revenge stories back and forth throughout Neo's career. After that point in time, he had to leave the team. They brought in Element and others. They got a Pabst back again, Pope, and he would play in some other teams like 64 AMD, the German version, MTW later, but really his career kind of faded out here. It was just EPS, domestic play, and then we didn't hear much of him. He basically was non-existent in the latter half of 1.6, despite being such a blossoming, flourishing, shining star of the German scene for a whole bunch of years. During his time in Counter-Strike, he was top 4 at a bunch of majors, had some very big performances, especially in 2003, 2004. He won, I think it was 4 EPS titles, including with 2 different teams, which shows what a talented player he was. Now, his skill set as a player, he had very good pistols. He was particularly good with the USP. He didn't just spam it all the time like other people did. He had a really good first bullet accuracy. His deagle also was pretty good in terms of like one bulleting people, not spamming it. He was a pretty good rifler. He had a pretty good unsilenced Colt and AK. Again, his first bullet was very good, so he'd get the first bullet on you and burst and kill you, or then go into a full auto spray. He was a very good hybrid AWPer. He was known to use the AWP quite often. He was pretty good with it all in all. All around, from 2003 to 2004, I think he was the best all-around German player, the most skilled German player, the best impact in the server. And from 2003 to 2005, he was an elite German player, and at least for 2003 to 2004, would have been a top 10 player in the world. So amazingly, there was another Neo, and originally he was the Neo that we knew for the first few years of Counter-Strike. And actually his time to taper off at the end of 2005, beyond that he was just playing in Germany, well, 2006 was when the Polish Neo came along and won his first major, and then really dominated from there on out and became known as the world's best player for many years beyond that. So it's interesting how their careers kind of missed each other overall, despite the fact they had that meeting at Game Goon in, what did I say, it was 2004, I think, right? Where they lost, where the Polish Neo beat the half-Polish Neo. But yeah, Neo was a very good player from the German scene, and is one that is very much missed for the latter part of 1.6.